You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotechnology insiders. I'm Eric Schmidt, and my co-hosts today are Sam Fazeli and Yaron Werber, and we are hopeful to have shortly a special guest with us, Bio CEO John Crowley. For more information about our hosts and our guests, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. I think we are still waiting for John to join, and we'll try and check in on his status. But we certainly do have a lot to cover. And why don't we start with the obesity updates in the space? Sam, I know you picked on a couple things, and it was a very eventful week for both drug development and deal flow in this sector of biotech.
Yeah, so obviously we started Monday, as you said, Eric. It was one of these weeks where we just turned up in the office in London, and there you go. So Novo had their CagriSema data from the REDEFINE 2 trial. This is the follow-on from the REDEFINE 1. This was in obese diabetics, and share price took a major dive for reasons that I'm a little bit confused about, because we already kind of expected this trial not to necessarily be a significant effort here. So this is CagriSema. This is Novo's combination of an amylin with a GLP-1, cagrilintide and semaglutide, and the data that they reported put, as I said, something like about a 10% or 8% pressure on the share price, 12.6% placebo-adjusted weight loss, which seemed to us in line with what we've seen with Eli Lilly's Zepbound, which is of course not an amylin GLP-1, it's a GLP-1 GIP. So the interesting thing, of course, is that usually you do lose some efficacy in the diabetic patient population. In the REDEFINE 1 trial, which was obese patients, the data efficacy was 22.7%, or roughly 20% placebo adjusted. The number of patients who reached the top dose, which is one of the key things about the design of the Novo Nordisk trials, to REDEFINE 1 and REDEFINE 2, in that it allows patients to down titrate again or not go all the way to the top dose. In REDEFINE 1, which was obesity, it was 57%. In REDEFINE 2, I think they reached about a 62% or so of patients on the highest dose. So people always question, well, is that why the efficacy isn't that? It doesn't look as good as what Novo had suggested, which is what the issue is here. So that share price was down, and we are sitting here thinking, well, you've got a drug that's as good as Zepbound in this population, and previously 20% weight loss. And I'm definitely in the camp. I think, Eric, you're not far. You're part of this camp that it's enough in terms of talking about these percentages. 20, 25, 30%. Some of these patients are not going to feel very good at those sort of weight losses if you particularly rush them into it. And I think there's even been some talk that some of the trials that are ongoing, people are losing so much weight so quickly that they're not managing, and they're having to dose down. So that was the story that we started our Monday with, Eric.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. There's just too much investor focus on singular numbers. And you can game the system, as you know, Sam, with regard to, including female patients or more obese patients in these studies at baseline. So we've got to get past that. We've got to start looking at the more subtle aspects that these products are likely to be differentiated on in the marketplace itself, which isn't the absolute magnitude of weight loss, but things like convenience and tolerability and safety. So great summary there. Thank you. Actually, I think before we get to the deal flow in obesity, maybe we'll welcome John Crowley. John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Hi, thanks for having me again.
Thank you for being on. For those of you who don't know John, he's president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Bio. And of course, he's a longtime executive, having been a founder and CEO at Amicus Therapeutics, a company focused on the treatment of rare diseases, which he led for really almost 2 decades and had tremendous success on. John, thank you again for joining us. And we're thrilled. I think Yaron, Sam, and I are all very keen to sort of just get your top line thoughts of where we are, what bio is trying to do in this sort of tumultuous geopolitical environment, and how things are going in Washington.
Yeah, Eric, thank you again for having me on. And again, I think pretty timely given where we are here. I thought what I'd do in the upcoming, in kind of my upfront comments is just frame it from a big picture standpoint, kind of where we are, why I am optimistic that we are going to have a more favorable policy environment for biotechnology than we've had in some time. And I'll give you some specific data points around that. I'll also just touch on what the threats are and how we're working through and trying to manage those threats, and then also talk about some specific opportunities. And then I'll maybe just conclude with just our priorities at Bio. So if that's okay, let me go ahead and start. Again, I do believe that on balance, there are more positive opportunities than there are negative ones for biotech. And I know, believe me, I know how hard this has been for 4+ years in this environment. I was down at an investment conference earlier this week in Miami, and there were a couple hundred investors, hedge fund managers, mutual fund managers. I understand how difficult the pressures are in biotechnology, and some of them are structural. And that's where I do think we have a unique opportunity to begin to address this broad ecosystem. Because at the end of the day, one of our great challenges has been the system has evolved to the point where developing medicines, it just takes too long, costs way too much money, is inconsistent even within therapeutic areas, and is uncertain. We need a system that provides certainty faster and oftentimes more clearly, positive or negative, so we could decide to advance an asset or move on. So one of the fundamental kind of premises, if you will, that we've been working on with the administration, with policymakers, with lawmakers, is to have them understand why they need to care about biotechnology, why it's so important. And I can tell you there is a strong consensus, bipartisan, that biotechnology is a critical strategic asset for the United States. And I mentioned this before, but I'll say it again, that the world and everyone living in the world is a better, safer, more prosperous, and healthier place when we and our allies lead in biotechnology, realizing that it is a global ecosystem and countries like China will continue to play an important part of that ecosystem. But we have to be the leader. That view is widely held in the administration, from the president to RFK to other senior leaders in the administration, but also on Capitol Hill among Democrats and Republicans. And what we continue to emphasize in every discussion is you start with that as the basic premise, and that you need to care about biotechnology for the public health, as an engine of economic growth, and for our national security. Those points really ring true. Let me just give you a couple of data points, and believe me, look, I get all the uncertainty, the chaos, and trying to manage through all of that. We had I think, an excellent board meeting with the Bio Board in New York back in February, and we touched directly on this. And my view was, and the view of other speakers for bio, our view is that um, you need to distinguish between what are trial balloons, what is rhetoric, what are extemporaneous comments, what are even executive orders that may likely not survive or succeed. They may be withdrawn, they may be blocked by the courts, and then what is actual policy. And then we need to marry that against what are our handful or two of key priorities. And there's many times that we're having these discussions behind closed doors, and many times we have and will rise them to a public level as well. So just a couple of data points on why I'm increasingly optimistic, mindful of all the challenges and uncertainty, and actually, in many areas being a hopefully for bio to be a strong voice for the things that we care about. First, I'll begin with the FDA. My almost singular focus toward the back end of February, when there was so much uncertainty and so many threats to the workforce, the culture, the stability of the FDA, was to figure who are the influencers here, where are the centers of gravity, and who are the decision makers. And this is a bit of the art of advocacy. And this was all done behind closed doors, but I can assure you very intensely so that people at the White House, at HHS, people within Doge understood the critical importance of the FDA and that we need a strong FDA. It needs to be reformed and modernized, advanced. We need to implement very bold ideas. And I will tell you, leadership of the FDA would welcome that. I think Dr. McCurry coming into the FDA, I know welcomes that as well. We made a lot of progress. And you saw too, when I put that piece, if many of you may have seen it in Stat 2 weeks ago, relaying the president's State of the Union from 8 years ago and our meeting in the Oval Office and his comments at that speech and in some forums afterwards, talking about the importance of newer and better medicines and addressing redundancies and bureaucracies in the regulatory process. In fact, even beyond that, to the clinical trial paradigm. People are increasingly aligned around that. We've had very serious conversations with the right decision makers. There will be change at the FDA. Our job is to make sure that we advocate strongly and fiercely for positive change at the FDA. So we've made progress. I think we've stopped some of the bad ideas that were in motion. And right now, I know the FDA, like other government agencies, are coming up with what I know will be thoughtful plans for reimagining the FDA, but we need to make sure we're strengthening the workforce and protecting some key leaders at FDA as well. Another data, just a couple more data points here too. One is on RFK. Now that Secretary Kennedy is in the seat, we've all followed closely the measles outbreak. Bio continues to be a strong advocate for the importance of vaccines. We have a very large campaign that we're going to be launching shortly to inspire people, educate people, and frankly frighten them if we don't have vaccines. And again, this gets to the broader issue of trust in data and trust in science. And data is on our side here, and we'll use that. So I do think this is one of the great risks in this environment that we have to be a strong voice for, engaging in many forums privately, but now increasingly publicly as well. But I will say with this measles outbreak, there was an interview that RFK Jr. did the other night with what's his face, Sean Hannity on Fox News. And again, I don't watch a lot of cable news, but I wanted to listen to this. And I heard maybe for the first time that RFK specifically said, with respect to measles, he encouraged parents to get their children vaccinated, not encouraged to talk to their doctors, encouraged to get them vaccinated. So I think a step hopefully in the right direction, but just one data point. And I'll also point to the Secretary Kennedy also held a roundtable with leaders in the stem cell field. You may have seen that reported today to talk about how do we break down regulatory barriers to advance stem cell research. So I think that's a positive step forward. Another data point I'll give is you may have seen also HHS put out earlier this week a further buyout offer for all employees, a $25,000 one-time payment if they agree to resign their position. The only groups that were exempted from that were FDA inspectors and reviewers. And I think that reflects an acknowledgement of the important role that FDA and a strong FDA workforce play. We saw the withdrawal of the nominee for CDC at the last hour yesterday, and that came directly from the White House. The other data point I'll provide in the last one before I just talk briefly about some threats and opportunities is the president's joint address to Congress a week ago. It was the longest State of the Union or joint address in at least modern history. The president talked about a lot of things in that speech. The one thing, though, we never heard, drug prices. We didn't hear about evil pharmaceutical companies. I'd encourage you to compare that to prior states of the union. This was very different, and this was not by accident. I think it reflects again, a view of the increased importance of the biotechnology and biopharma industry. So some small data points, I think some more significant ones, but I am sensing that there is a much more positive environment from a policy standpoint. With that said, there are threats. I think our most significant threats, again, I mentioned vaccines. We've got to get back the trust. Again, this tends to be a very state issue, and we're focused in particular states. But again, the data is our friend, and we're working to build a key stakeholders, community of interest, advanced data, build our relationships, particularly at the state level. And again, I think there are more, or at least as many, threats and opportunities in the states as there are in the federal government. Beyond that is MFN, index pricing, most favored nation. The president still believes that I think we've evolved the conversation even before the election to the where he's of the point of view and the administration's of the point of view. It's not that Americans pay too much for drugs, it's that other countries pay too little. Kind of a NATO analogy, if you will. Now, how we solve for that, I think the first principle is that it's not going to go away. There has to be a constructive conversation. We have to be thoughtful and proactive in policy solutions here. And I think it ties into another threat, and that's, of course, everything going on with tariffs as well. Bio just completed an industry survey we had sent out. We're just now finalizing going through the raw data over the last couple of days. But probably not surprisingly, I think some of the key takeaways are going to be that significant tariffs on our industry will harm access to medicines, could potentially raise the prices of medicines, intentionally or unintentionally. And it also will highlight just how dependent we are on an overseas supply chain, particularly in Europe. Those are some major threats that we have to continue to be deeply engaged in and to shape in a way in which they don't harm the innovation environment or access, and perhaps also tie into some other key opportunities. On the opportunity side, I do think there is an increasing likelihood this year that we are going to see real reform of the PBMs and the middlemen. We came very close to it, of course, in December, and that whole bill kind of blew up for a whole other reasons well beyond PBMs. But there is a strong sense in the White House that there are inefficiencies in the system, that the middlemen, or the middles, as President Trump refers to it as, are not advancing the interests of patients, the economy, or the public health. So we're getting a really good series of conversations continuing there. What legislative vehicle that could be put into, could some of that be done by executive order even perhaps, is something we, pharma, and others are exploring. I do think we'll at least have serious discussions, negotiations, and hearings on fixing the IRA. And the two parts that we're focused on are the orphan part of it with orphan cures that's now been reintroduced in this new Congress, as has the EPIC Act, EPIC and Mini together, on the disparity, the pill penalty on 9 versus 13. And this is also, I'll highlight where this is a more favorable Congress for us as well. You no longer have Bernie Sanders as chair of the Help Committee. You have Dr. Bill Cassidy on the Senate side. On the House side, you have Chairman Guthrie, Congressman Guthrie from Kentucky, a West Point grad. We know Congressman Guthrie quite well. He is a strong champion for our industry, for innovation, for patients, as is the Health Chair Subcommittee, a pharmacist by training, Buddy Carter from Georgia, also aligns, I think, with the way that we see the world. So I would expect that we'll, in the months ahead into the summer, have hearings on the dangerous impact that we're seeing, the dislocation of resources because of these mistakes in the IRA that need to get fixed. 9 versus 13, of course, a much heavier lift than orphan financially. And again, this will be part, I think, of a broader discussion, negotiation. We and pharma and others are coming up with ideas for what the pay-fors would be. Other acute near-term opportunities, we're going to see significant tax law work coming forward. And this is where Speaker Johnson's got a really tough needle to thread. He literally has a 1-seat margin on this. There's going to be an awful lot of lobbying and advocacy from every industry you can imagine when it comes to this tax law. For us, things like the R&D tax credit, perhaps even the orphan tax credit, and potentially also tied into encouraging a renaissance of manufacturing here in the United States. That tax law, I think that'll be a very important vehicle for that. Another opportunity that we continue to work through, and this is really frustrating, is the priority review voucher in the pediatric diseases. Again, we almost had this in the December bill. There was some opposition, but we were able to move it through bipartisan. It's not going to be in this continuing resolution now that it looks like the Senate will take up and move forward today. There are other vehicles into the spring that we, with the advocacy community and pediatric cancer and pediatric rare diseases, are working on. That has to get done. And there is very, very strong bipartisan support for it. It's almost like the perfect program, encouraging resources into some of the rarest of diseases that affect children, again, cancers, metabolic disorders, and it doesn't cost the government a dime. Our more intermediate priorities, by intermediate, I mean through this Congress over the next 2 years into the next Congress, again, where there are some unique threats and opportunities. I think that's going to be in women's health. We have to address the disparities in women's health. When two-thirds of Alzheimer's cases, when 80% of autoimmune diseases, when there are very, very differing impacts in cardiovascular disease for women, we've been underinvested there tremendously. And as an industry, we've not had the focus that we need to. So we need to think about incentives programs that will drive more research for women's health. Secondly, cell and gene therapy, where in many ways the entire model is broken. A third is intellectual property, and fourth is vaccines. And what we're doing at Bio is putting together task forces. And I'll be a co-chair of the task forces. Each will also have two co-chairs from our board of directors, and we'll have formal meetings. We'll define our remit. I'll then to be able to, at the guidance of the board and our membership, be able to allocate specific resources to programs, again, aligning our policy, our advocacy, our communications. But these are areas, again, where they're like in intellectual property, for instance, vaccines, unique threats, and other areas where kind of now is the time. And this, I think, rises to be an important priority for Bio. I'll just conclude with, and then happy to take any questions, Eric and Jeroen and others. On the strategic initiatives, again, putting them in the buckets of innovation and access. For innovation, a number of different initiatives, and strategic. Our view is this is a multi-year effort, hopefully within this administration, but perhaps even beyond. But critically important for big, bold ideas to shape the ecosystem. And in some cases, I think we could have early wins here as well. The first is re-onshoring, the renaissance of manufacturing. And we continue to advocate at Bio that, yes, this needs to be anchored in the United States, but we need to think about this more broadly among our allies. So, for instance, tomorrow morning, I'm leaving with a number of Bio staff and a number of CEOs on our board and senior executives to go to Japan for 5 days. And we have meetings at the most senior levels of government in Japan on the health side, on the industrial and manufacturing and economic side. We're meeting patient groups. We're meeting with the PMDA, the Japanese FDA equivalent, talking about strengthening our ties with Japan, including on the manufacturing side. So I think there's some real opportunities to put in policies and programs here in a number of different vehicles that will drive private capital toward a renaissance in manufacturing. And we'll have more on the actual policies of that coming out soon. The other important part on innovation is going to be reimagining, again, the FDA and the clinical trial paradigm. There is a real appetite to do that in the administration. Again, we continue to advocate for a very strategic, very thoughtful approach. And I know Dr. Makari, coming in as FDA commissioner, is strongly supportive of that as well. And I'll be coming back to you guys for ideas on what that would be that we could take back to FDA and to the administration. And by you guys, I mean certainly everybody on this call, but also broadly in our entire biotech ecosystem. And then on the access side, for us, again, identifying, breaking down the barriers. Why do people go without their medicines? And be they economic reasons, out-of-pocket costs, or increasingly insurance practices. Insurance is out of control. And we've gotten to the point again where take a CAR T therapy in cancer. It's almost like the doctor writes a prescription for a very serious life-threatening disease, advocating, or instructing the patient to go on a therapy at the patient's consent, of course, with some of our most advanced technologies. And then it's almost like it's a recommendation that goes to the insurance company to decide. And when we look at these prior authorizations, step edits, the broad utilization management, and it's certainly within the Medicare Advantage programs, but it's well beyond that into the private insurance market. We've got to take that head on. And so these are big, bold issues that we're going to be working with. So that's my comments up front. Happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you for all those updates, John. It's great to hear your optimism. I think we need a little bit of that in biotech, and also the fact that bio has quite a bit of influence behind the scenes. I know Sam and Yaron are going to want to chime in here, but let me just start with one question, which is this period of chaos and uncertainty that we've been dealing with. As you well know, there's nothing investors like less than chaos and uncertainty. And
Yes.
you kind of make the point that we need to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. There's some policy, there's some extraneous stuff. From where most of us sit, it's hard to know what the administration may or may not mean when it floats these trial balloons. So, how is this going to play out? Are we going to need to get just a little bit less attuned to what's happening in Washington in these early days of the administration, or might things change in a way that's more helpful for us?
No, Eric, I would encourage you to stay very attuned to what's happening in Washington because this policy environment is so critically important. 25 years ago when I came into biotech, I didn't pay attention to policy at all. I cared about science, technology, scouring the world for finding ideas for some of these rare diseases. Now there's so many ideas, so many tools, technologies, but most of our challenges now are man-made. Be they on basic research funding. And we do advocate. I want to emphasize this virtuous circle of innovation that we talked about. I talked about my first day on the job a year ago at Biotech, looking at every part of that circle of what it takes to make newer and better medicines, always beginning at our academic research centers. And the NIH is an incredible strategic advantage, and we need to continue to invest there. We've emphasized a lot of that behind the scenes. You'll see more of it now publicly ahead as well. But again, you got to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff here and what's actually happening. And again, I'd refer back to what wasn't said. That was very significant that the president had an almost 2 hour State of the Union and never mentioned drug prices, even in passing, never railed on evil pharmaceutical companies. So I'd encourage you to think about what's not being said as well. There's one other data point I'll provide. On first week in April, the week of April 7th, will be a very important week. I'd mentioned before that Congress, from time to time, authorizes these multi-year national security commissions. They've done it with cyber, with AI. Um, they're doing it now. A couple of years ago, they formed a commission, the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, and their report is going to come out. And we've been very, very closely working with them, particularly over the last year, as we've emphasized the critical importance of biotech for our national security. And I think you'll see these will be very specific policy proposals around manufacturing, around the FDA, around clinical trials, looking at a whole bunch of areas where we can break down barriers. I think it'll be very, very favorable for our industry. And there'll be a lot of, hopefully, media and attention around that. I would really encourage you to look at that report because these reports don't sit on a shelf. They are implemented. Senator Todd Young of Indiana is chairman of the commission, and he and Senator Padilla from California and others take this very, very seriously. We have private industry folks like Eric Schmidt involved and others. This will be a very important and very serious report. So when we see something of prominence like that coming out of Washington, now it's coming from Congress, but it goes directly to the White House. And now the job is to take those policy recommendations and find the vehicles to implement them over the next year or so. So yes, you got to again think about what's rhetoric, what's trial balloons, what are executive orders that aren't really going to go anywhere or be stopped, and what's most important. Where are the threats? Where are the opportunities? And you got to prioritize.
John, it's Sam here. I'm sitting on the other side of the world to the United States, so this is all something that's a lot harder for us to keep an eye on because you obviously see it through the lens of other media, etc. But first, I wanted to add to Eric saying, thank God you're here because your optimism is something that we've all needed, given the state of the sector. But let me just throw a couple of things at you. I've just been talking to somebody from the CDC, and it was one of those folks who was let go and then rehired. And they've also got a situation where I think there's a lot of people who are wanting to leave, partly because they don't want to be involved in doing a study looking at vaccines and autism, which is something that I think a lot of them, in
Yeah,
their
yeah.
professional opinion, is settled. So there are these elements that are still ongoing, and then you've got the feeling of what looks like anti-science from this side at least. So I may be completely wrong. And I've heard everything you said, but you still have confidence that these are things that are not going to be an issue in the long term, and that science is going to prevail.
I do, and again, I think it's perhaps misplaced to say that there is an anti-science view in the administration. And all the challenges you point out are absolutely right, and those are ones that we push back on very hard. There is no question that there is no link between autism and vaccines. We were pleased to hear Dr. McCary in his hearing said that point blank. We hadn't heard that in a prior hearing. Um, so those are things that we need to be incredibly vigilant and engaged on. And when we see anti-science views or areas that undermine the public trust in science, technology, leadership, we need to be really vocal about that. And sometimes it's very vocal privately. This all isn't going to be fought by press releases and clever commercials. And those tend to be the most persuasive discussions I find. But at times it does need to rise to a higher level. When I wrote that piece in Stat and it came out 2 weeks ago, none of that was a surprise to lawmakers, policymakers at the White House, HHS, anywhere. They've heard all of that from me and from others. Um, this was going on the record and framing it in a very public way, but also it was directed to other stakeholders, including, you guys, our companies, our community, and, for instance, the workforce at the FDA. We have emphasized repeatedly to Doge that you can't go in with a wrecking ball. You lose key people, you lose key talent. It's not going to be, well, we'll make mistakes and we'll fix it down the road. No, you're going to harm innovation, you're going to harm patients, and you might as well just give the whole industry to China. You can't do it. And we've given them examples of why that doesn't work. And I think that, again, when you look at this buyout offer this week and the fact that FDA inspectors and reviewers were exempted, I think they get it, and there's some people who are aligned around wanting more medicines and wanting a successful biotech industry, not without its challenges, not without its opposition, but that's kind of our job to manage and balance that on behalf of the industry. So again, I didn't say I was wholly enthusiastically positive. I said on balance, I believe there are more positive opportunities than there are threats, but there are threats.
John, it's Yaron, and again, thanks. Always great to hear from you. So I'm actually going to ask a question about China because we've
Yeah.
discussed on this show many times, right? The innovation now that's coming out of China and where IP and drugs are now getting founded, but they're actually coming here more for development and commercialization, which is another avenue of innovation. I think some view it as a threat, but along with that, obviously, there's become a question of what is biosecure really going to mean? What about manufacturing? And then, of course, there's biosecure kind of broadly on this industry. I think many of us thought that it was a done deal. We have a Washington research group that thought that was going to get done last year, and it didn't get done, and that was very surprising. And it did seem like there's a lot of stakeholders sort of behind the scenes that had a lot of input, and of course, you and Bio had a lot of input. Kind of what are you expecting, and what's the timeline?
Yeah, Jeroen, I think it's important to realize biosecure is two things. It is a piece of legislation, and as it came out last year in a very public and forceful way, again, our job at Bio, we perfectly aligned around the concept, the second part of biosecure, the concept of biosecurity. The specific piece of legislation, we said we had some areas of concern. We did our survey, of course. We met privately with members of the China Select Committee, members of the intelligence community, to share our thoughts and including the fact that you can't cut off access to some of these key partners, particularly the manufacturing partners, because again, you'll slow biomedical research, you'll harm patients, and you'll actually work against your national security interests. They listened to that. They made the changes. In fact, there were so many changes to that bill. While it did pass, it wasn't overwhelming. And there are some people, and you talk to Jake Auchincloss up in Boston, Congressman Auchincloss, he'll tell you he voted against it, not because he's against the concept of biosecurity. At the end of the day, he thought the legislation was so watered down as to be ineffective. So it didn't pass. It wasn't included in the National Defense Authorization at the end of the year. Our view is that it's possible, but it's in a form right now that's largely ineffective or toothless, but increasingly unlikely that it will even become law. But what it has done is to raise, again, that second part of what biosecure is, and that's the concept of biosecurity. That a lot of it, again, is grounded in supply chain, resiliency of the supply chain. But it's even more broad than that. It's the entire biomedical research establishment, including, of course, our industry. And what it's done is to elevate that view that, okay, that is a threat. But the mistake I think of the Act, Biosecure Act, was to think that you're going to prohibit activities. You're going to penalize somehow investment or partnerships, the sticks, if you will. That doesn't work really well. There's some incredible science going on in China, and they're moving in very, very fast. I think in some ways we've got a couple of years till we're at parity or worse with China. And again, we're of the view that we need to continue and maintain our lead our lead in the United States among our allies as the critical center of excellence in biotechnology. But don't look at what you're going to do to punish China. Look at what we're going to do to break down our barriers and to allow biotechnology to flourish. And that's when I come back to this National Security Commission report that, again, I think will be very, very positive in changing the ecosystem for us. But a lot of this is against the backdrop of this great rivalry with China.
John, thank you very much for your time. We know how busy you are. All of us at Biotech Hangout owe you a debt of
No,
gratitude for
no,
all the
thank you
work
for
you're
having
doing,
me.
and really appreciate the time and hope to connect soon.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.
Okay, we can head back to our week's worth of high activity and obesity. Yaron, did you want to touch on the two key deals that were done or not done, maybe, with the Zealand Roche transaction and then Viking going at it alone with their manufacturing contract?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like one of the things that has driven up the obesity sector, the biotechs in obesity, is the chance for M&A, and of course that's comes natural because this is a game for really big companies. So there's the two companies that were widely expected to have gotten acquired. One is Zealand Pharma out of Europe, and the other one is Viking Therapeutics in the U.S. So earlier this week, Zealand announced a deal with Roche for essentially combining the GLP-1 injectable from Roche, which they bought actually as a part of the 3 billion deal of Carmot. That's a CT-388, and combine that with petrelintide, which is the amylin analog from Zealand. It's a 50-50 deal, a huge upfront. I think it's 5.6 billion altogether. Roche made a huge upfront payment that then enabled Zealand to do 50-50 for the back end of the deal. So just to give you a sense, the upfront was 1.65 billion. It's fairly sizable. And then they're both going to now take that into phase 3 studies. 388 from Roche looks very good. It had a 19% reduction at 24 weeks. It did have some dropouts, almost 12% all in between the upfront and the maintenance. And there was a high rates of nausea and vomiting, and this is sort of as they got to the high dose. So it's unclear exactly which dose they're going to take forward. Petrelintide looks good. It does look better so far than the amylin that's a part of CagriSema. It's a higher dose. It's obviously going to be more potent. So this is something very promising to watch all in. Of course, this area is getting heating up, but Zealand did come up from the bottom on the heels of this deal. But by and large, the stock is down a lot from the peak with the expectation that they're going to get acquired. But at least they're well capitalized and they have a good partner. The other one is Viking, and that's a small biotech, and they have an injectable GLP-GIP that is looking, really good. And they have an oral version of it, which is facing that's a GLP-1 uh, peptide with an oral delivery. Obviously, that's got its own challenges always as an oral. The efficacy there is not as good as injectable. But again, this is a company that is well capitalized. They have 900 million, but that's obviously not sufficient long term, and that's expected to get acquired too. Their data look good. Again, I think the big question was, how are you going to develop it by yourself? So what happened this week is they entered into a deal with Corden Pharma. This is to produce the active pharmaceutical ingredient. They're going to pay 150 million over 3 years. And just to give you a sense of the volume, the Corden Pharma is going to have capacity for 100 million auto-injectors annually, 100 million syringes, and 1 billion tablets. I mean, huge volume. Um, Now, the question, does that mean that Viking is more or less likely to get acquired? And there's still a question, then how do you finance? So I think that that stock obviously is facing those questions, and in general has also been under pressure. Either way, you do need to get API. So maybe this is another clearing event toward an acquisition, or they're just going to stay it alone. But this area is going to become very competitive. You know, there's Amgen coming in, there's Metsera, there's Kylera, there's a lot going on.
Sam, I know you follow all these moving parts in obesity very closely. Love to get your views, but I guess in particular on this acquisition question that Yaron brings up, who may or may not get acquired going forward. We've seen a couple of deals in the amylin space, Gubra last week and now Zealand this week. We haven't seen many deals in the GLP-1 space, and we haven't seen any acquisitions. Are we kind of past peak frothiness in terms of what would you consider M&A, at least with regard to GLP-1s, and maybe even past acquisition windows for amylins as well?
Well, so Eric, I think share prices tell you that, right? To a degree, when you look at it, and Viking, GP, structured therapeutics, Altimmune, whichever company you look at, that tells you that. However, there are elements here now that have lined up in a situation where maybe not necessarily M&A, but if you have a company that's got just amylin, let's say AbbVie, right, which have just entered the fray with amylin, given that everybody is looking at these combinations of GLP-1, GIP, or GLP-1 and amylin, or whatever shape or form you like, I would say that they would need to build a pipeline here, or a bigger bag for those sales folks. Um, and 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 I've been talking about this to one of my a couple of people. If you think about the old world of SGLT2s, which is the diabetes therapies, there's two drugs on the market that are very similar in terms of efficacy and side effect profile: AstraZeneca's and Lilly's. Who's is selling better? Lilly. They have broader indication base, but also they have a bigger diabetes business. So is that why Lilly's SGLT2 Jardiance is doing better than Farxiga? Maybe. If that is true, and I think a lot of people believe that if you have a franchise, you're better placed, um, then someone like AbbVie would have to create that franchise again. Does this mean a takeout of one of these GLP-1 companies that we've mentioned? Or does it mean a licensing deal or a partnership? Possibly. Either way, I think it would be good for them, as we've seen with the share price for Zealand, even though it's sold off because everyone's now worried that the next catalyst is whatever, a year away or a year and a half away. That's the world we live in. So that is the way I would look at it, to be honest. And I am on the side that the Viking manufacturing deal is a realistic thing, is a important thing for them to have done. A lot of people talk about the manufacturing capacity for these peptides. So they've kind of solved that problem. Either way, whether they're going it alone or with a partner, this is a problem that needed to be solved. So I don't see it necessarily as a signal that there's no M&A deal, although that's what some people said.
Thanks for those thoughts. I think a lot of us would feel a lot better if the Viking asset were in a partner's hands, given the inability of a smaller company like Viking to really compete on an execution standpoint. But staying with the deal flow theme, we did see a couple of M&A transactions this week that are worth mentioning. They come again in the small cap oncology space, with Sun Pharma having acquired Checkpoint and Bristol Myers consolidating its interest in 2seventy Bio. That BMY 270 deal, of course, comes just weeks after the other half of Bluebird is being acquired. And this all follows Jazz Chimerics. So a lot of, again, small cap oncology acquisitions. It strikes me that we'll probably see more, to be honest, because these onesies and twosies in oncology, $100, $200, $300 million type drug candidates, really ought to be part of a bigger oncology organization from a leverage and margin standpoint. Makes a lot of sense. And also because of the environment we're in, we have many small cap oncology companies, some even with marketed drugs that are trading at or below cash. So I'd expect that type of trend to continue. But Yaron, one small cap oncology deal that we have yet to see happen is the SpringWorks Merck KGaA potential acquisition. What's the latest there?
Yeah, I mean, the latest there is that there is no update. So for everybody listening, recall that this is a company, SpringWorks, launched Ogsiveo very successfully for desmoid tumors. They're the only drug on the market, and they beat numbers. They just got Gomekli approved. That's a MEK inhibitor for neurofibromatosis 1, the plexifoid form. And the competitor there is AstraZeneca. The AstraZeneca only has a label for peds, and it's got a lot of black box issues and drug-drug interactions and safety issues. And SpringWorks got approved for both adults and pediatrics with a better label. So it should be a better product. Between those two drugs, consensus is that they're going to sell $1 billion to $1.5 billion, and maybe the up is $2 billion. It's a $3.8 billion company. So Merck KGaA put out a press release sort of toward the latter half of January saying they're in advanced discussions. As everybody knows, Merck KGaA has a division in neuro and oncology, and the oncology products are actually orphan focused, just like here. So it's a perfect fit. It's a big company that is globally oriented. They have the capital. They have 15 billion of capital. So we all thought that this is actually makes sense because we do think that SpringWorks wants to and needs to sell. And of course, they need to now launch the drugs globally, and they're small biotech out of Connecticut. So we all the deal is gonna get done. The stock went up to $60 from 32 at JP Morgan. But it's been taking a long time. It's almost 2 months now. Merck KGaA reported about a week ago on the call. They really didn't say a lot other than, they have 15 billion in capital and they're focusing on healthcare and products, and in licensing. I think that was the message. And of course, SpringWorks immediately went down maybe as much $10, in those 2 weeks. So we're all waiting. Management are returning calls. They're not coming to conferences. So next big catalyst is probably when they report the first quarter. Come April, and if they indeed will do a conference call, I think at that point we will think that they're probably not getting acquired imminently. But in the meantime, the stock is kind of hovering around 50. It makes a lot of sense to do a deal. Um, we were hopeful for a deal. We're all back in watchful waiting. We think Merck KGaA is the most likely acquirer based on size.
Okay, so maybe patience will be a virtue here, but we're in an interesting kind of intermediary time frame. Let's leave the transaction discussion and deal flow discussion and turn to some data updates. And maybe the highlight of the week could have been Amgen's Uplizna update in myasthenia gravis. Yaron, do you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and earlier this week we actually designated argenx as our European top pick. I think maybe for the fifth time in a row. It's obviously one of the premier companies in oncology. I'm sorry, in the biotech sector, and certainly out of Europe, probably just along with CB. The the competition here is Uplizna, which is everybody knows is an antibody that depletes CD19 cells. It can be dosed twice a year, and that's what's really nice about it. We've seen the 26-week data at AAN, and recall at that time it's a slow onset of action, but at the same time they're able to taper off steroids, which is a big positive, and it's very safe. And so now we got the 52-week data as a late breaker abstract. We don't have the full data. It's going to be on April 8th, but we can certainly see pretty much as expected that the curves continue to separate. So at that point, you got a dose at 26 weeks and another dose at 52 weeks and nothing in between. So you're totally off therapy, which is very nice. And the data is not quite as good as Vyvgart. It's pretty good. I mean, the MG-ADL is almost the same. It's sort of negative 2.8 versus, let's say, -3. The QMG, which is the secondary endpoint, is -2, -4.3, shy of Vyvgart at -5.3. But again, it offers you a very nice option in a huge market that is very much a growth market. It's about 6 billion and growing right now in GMG. So we definitely think Uplizna is going to find a role, maybe to replace C5 antagonists because it's safer and you don't need to get vaccinated and it's cheaper and more convenient, or in patients that fail Vyvgart, or maybe maintenance after patients get into remission. So anyway, the whole CD19 premise is not really playing out clinically.
I know investors always like a good fight between two competitors in markets like this, but the number one parameter behind the success of either of these two drugs is going to be the size of the market, right? And these I&I markets, they just keep growing and growing and giving and giving. So make sure you don't lose sight of the forest through the trees here. Let's turn our discussion over to earnings recaps. We actually had a couple of stragglers report this week in BioNTech and Legend. Sam, did you want to give us the update from BioNTech?
Sure. Look, they had a pretty rough week, although it was against a very difficult tape. So the results were on Monday, the 10th. And they reported actually 2024 was in line, but nobody seems to care about that. Everybody cares about the outlook, which was quite interesting because they guided to 2 billion euro sales. So for one, assume the euro dollar parity or if you want to divide by 1.1. 2 billion sales, and that's against the consensus of 2.5 based on Bloomberg. So what happened here? They said at the same time, and remember Pfizer, where most of their revenue comes from for the COVID vaccine, said that they're going to have the same revenue essentially as last year, which was about $5 billion. So why is BioNTech not getting the same revenue as last year? Well, and the volume they said is going to be similar to last year. And their assumptions are pricing and also share. So, of course, what's left here is the write-downs. Now, to be fair to them, a few $100 million write-down in inventory, which happens with vaccines, you manufacture and you hope that people buy it. If they don't buy it, you've got the stock. So you have to essentially write it off, especially in a world where the vaccine changes every year. So this is the case here. This is the case with flu. So this is nothing against BioNTech. It's just the way it is. And so it's write-downs mostly. There are probably a couple of other elements, but I think that is the biggest number. Then you add all that up, and you get to a cash burn of something in the region of 1.5 to 1.7 billion euros for the year. On top of that, they've spent some more cash. They bought Biotheus, and they've got a couple of settlements. So we think that they're going to end the year, this year, something in the region of 14 billion. Now, why is that a problem? It's not. The reality is this is a massive cash balance, right? But you do then create a situation in that you have to somehow keep that enterprise value going up. And the only way to do that is through delivering on your pipeline, which Yaron is going to talk about because there's a conference coming up. And I think very near term, there's some data coming. So Yaron, over to you.
Yeah, and just to even give you a sense, because we got a lot of questions on BioNTech. Sort of what's the worst case scenario, right? What is cash? So recall a year ago or 9 months ago, right before the famous ASCO, where PD-1s, VEGF bispecifics really hit it, they had about $80 in cash. Heading into this ASCO, we believe we're gonna have about $60 in cash. And the stock's at $100, 100 euros right now. So everything I mentioned, by the way, is euros, not dollars. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a sense where they are and why the pipeline is so important. So there's going to be, we've seen data from Summit, recall, that have competing product. They showed initial survival data in lung cancer that looks good with a hazard ratio of 0.8 and about half the events, the survival events happening. And they're going to update that in short order. That's probably going to be the most important data for the class. And then with BioNTech, we've seen some survival so far in triple negative. We've seen a little bit of survival so far in non-small cell, but now we're going to see the small cell lung cancer data, and that's coming in Paris on March 28th. So it's going to be in first line and second line. And there's going to be a lot of follow-up. So we're really going to be able to begin to tell, like, is there really a survival benefit with these drugs? We anticipate that the PFS would look good. The big question always with survival is, can you actually show survival benefit? Because there isn't a great correlation with checkpoint inhibitors between PFS and survival in small cell. But there's going to be a lot of data now coming between them and Summit over the next 3 months. So Look at the risk reward here is getting pretty interesting to a lot of people. The stock back at 100 euros, and it's worth following. The pipeline is definitely interesting.
Well, there, as you say, are a number of milestones that are upcoming from these PD-1 VEGF bispecifics, and obviously it's an enormous market where you can potentially take on a PD-1 like Pembro and show superiority to what is today the world's largest pharmaceutical. So a lot of action in the stocks for sure upcoming. Thanks for those updates. And maybe you want to take us home, Yaron, with the update from Legend, which is obviously also in another exciting and competitive marketplace.
Yeah, so this is where I always say this is the legend of legend, and it's about Carvykti, obviously the biggest selling CAR T now of any CAR T, and it's certainly the biggest one, obviously in myeloma. It's a BCMA CAR T, showed a survival benefit in second line onwards in myeloma, and of course J&J and Legend just couldn't make enough, and they were totally capacity constrained last year. They've now opened essentially 2 to 3 new facilities or access facilities, new expansions of current facilities between the 2 facilities in Europe, the Obelisk and Tech Lane in Belgium, the Raritan facility in New Jersey, and Novartis is a contract manufacturer, is actually making commercial supply for them now too. So they're going to double capacity this year, let's say from just under 1 billion to just about 2 billion globally. Um, and so that's this year. They're supposed to finish this year at more than 10,000 doses worth of capacity, and they've now, I think for the first time, is really beginning to crystallize that by 27 they're going to have 20 to 24,000 slots worth of capacity annually. I mean, it's a huge capacity, and no one has anything close to that utilization in the models yet. Of course, we're all waiting for the frontline data because that's the really big market. There's, as everybody remembers, 9,000 transplants in the US alone annually that could be ultimately replaced by CAR T per the data, assuming it works, and do think it's going to. And now they've just announced an additional 150 million, each one of almost 300 million worth of another expansion on the Tech Lane facility, which will come on board, I believe, in 27/28. So huge amount of capacity, and of course Gilead will come in with their competitor as well. Look, it's I remember when we started, right? Sadly, myeloma was a 6 month sort of median survival. Now survival, we're talking about 10 years, in some cases. So thank God there's going to be a lot of really good therapies, and capacity is ramping up quickly, which is good to see.
Well, your last comment really makes everything that John said earlier in our discussion ring so true. It's so critical that the U.S. Gets this right from not just a national security, but public health standpoint. So, Sam, Yaron, always wonderful to share the microphone with you guys. Thank you for your insights. We are out of time. So this concludes another episode of Biotech Hangout, and we hope to see you all next week.